Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 20th of April, where we are talking about A Raisin in the Sun and getting ready to finish our drama section. So your second journal, which is going to be on drama, will be due this upcoming Thursday on the 25th, and that'll be due by 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And basically, what you would be doing is very similar to what you did with the journal with short stories, except this time, rather than responding to 3 short stories, you would be responding to the 3 dramas we have covered in our drama unit. About a page or so response to Oedipus the King, about a page or so response to A Midsummer Night's Dream, and about a page or so response to A Raisin in the Sun. And for the journals, as you know, I grade informally. I don't grade for grammar or mechanics, just for content, as if we were having a conversation on paper. And I would give it a checkmark grade rather than a letter grade. Return that back to you. Hopefully that might help inform how you could proceed with your second paper. And paper number 2, which will be on drama, will be due on the 9th. And that is a Thursday. That's the 9th of May. And I had put some suggested paper topics in the syllabus and other documents folder, but they are merely suggestions. Feel free to combine, adapt, or whatever it is that you think you need to do to create a paper topic that you think would be important and relevant. And it would be a very similar sort of exercise to what you do with a short story. Approximately a 4 to 5 page paper, double space, 1-inch margins, but as long or as short as it needs to be for you to support your thesis. This time, however, of course, your paper would not be on short story. It would be about a specific element within one of the dramas. I'm asking you to write a critical paper, which means you don't need to use outside resources. That said, if you have your heart set on a research paper, we can talk a little bit about how to proceed with that. But as I've always said, the research paper is a more challenging exercise because not only do you have to incorporate what other people have said, but you also have to still contribute your own ideas and thoughts. And part of the purpose of this class is to help you read literature on your own so that you can come up with your own ideas and your own thoughts, not necessarily have to rely on a teacher or outside experts. And while you are working on things like your journal and your paper, we are headed into the final unit of the semester, which happens to be poetry. Though we've been dealing with poetry all semester long in some ways, because in our first unit on short story, we talked about a sorrowful woman and how she was contemplating writing a sonnet, which is a kind of poem that we talked about that's highly structured. In fact, we'll begin our poetry section by reading perhaps the most famous sonnet ever written by William Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And then when we got, or when we moved into the drama section, we talked about how Oedipus the King was originally written in poetry, though of course we're reading a translation. But the translation we read and the performance we saw tried to keep to the lyrical elements of the original. And certainly Midsummer Night's Dream is written in poetry. And A Raisin in the Sun, while not written in poetry, its title is inspired by a poem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Which I wanted to talk about today. And when we discuss all of these elements, I think what you'll see is that there are lots of possibilities for journal responses and also for paper topics as well. And when we finally get to the poetry section, you will have at the ending of that unit a poem or a poetry journal due, where I'm going to ask you to respond to 3 of the handful of poems that we'll be reading. We won't have time for paper number 3, but we will have time for a final examination. And I can tell you right now that the bulk of the final will be based on poetry. That what I will be doing is basically listing several of the poems we've discussed in class, ask you to choose 2, and to analyze those poems. And it will be open book, open notes, so you can utilize your notes and your journal responses and all of the rest. And since it's not a paper, I don't expect it to be as well developed or as well written as a paper, but still you should have, the basics of writing and interpretation there. And that would be the bulk of the final for 80 points. There are 20 points left over, 10 points for short story, 10 points for drama, where I will give you some shorter questions and choice within them to answer about short story or about drama, and I should say about drama, and that would basically round out the class. And you have 24 hours in which to do that final exam. If we were taking the final in class, you would have 2 hours. And I'll talk a little bit more about the final exam as we get a little bit closer. Right now, what I wanted you to do is to focus on your second journal, which again should be on drama, and think about how you would like to proceed with your second paper, which is also going to be on drama. And hopefully today's class will help with your response to A Raisin in the Sun. Lots of different ways that we could respond to this drama, but one of the ways that I suggest is thinking about names. And if you look at the notes below, you can see how incredibly deliberate Lorraine Hansberry was in terms of her choice of names. So when we think about some of the main characters in the drama, for instance, Mama, and certainly she acts as a mama figure to all of the characters, whether she's literally their mama, or mother-in-law, or grandmother. We see some generational tension there, for instance, between Mama and Ruth over the rearing of Travis. It's a particularly challenging situation because ultimately Ruth is the mother, but it is Mama's house. So when she oftentimes says, I ain't meddling, she is meddling when she's talking about ways to raise Travis. At any rate, Mama's last name is Younger. This is the Younger family. And as we talked about with Young Goodman Brown, the idea of being young or younger comes with both positive and negative associations. Some of the positives are that youth represents hope and optimism and adventure. Some of the negatives is that it might represent being naive or insecure. And we see both of these played out in the drama itself. And Mama's first name is quite telling as well, Lena, because this family leans on her. And not just for emotional support, but actually the basics of life, shelter, utilities, food, even Beneatha's tuition and her many hobbies, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we see both positives and negatives to all these characters. I very much appreciate the complexity that Lorraine Hansberry gives these characters. So they're very similar to real life individuals who tend to have complexity associated with them. That, yes, we can see Mom as somewhat domineering, for instance, when she's trying to impose her religious views or talking about Travis's child rearing. But she also is loving and very selfless in many respects, too. If nothing else, all of the family is living under her roof. So Walter Lee Jr., and it's important that he's a junior because Walter Lee is living in the shadow of his father, Big Walter Sr. The idea of Lee being his middle name is supposed to differentiate Walter Lee from Big Walter. And oftentimes when you name a child after yourself, it's because you're trying to continue on a family legacy. But that said, it could also be seen as somewhat selfish and self-centered, naming a child after yourself. The pressure that Walter feels to be the man that his father was is something that's integral in the text. Walter's also known as brother, which is in some respects used as a spiritual term when you're talking about fellow worshipers. Obviously, this is a religious family. But it also is a term in the Black community when you're talking about other members of the Black community. So brother seems to be an apt nickname. Again, the importance of being able to differentiate Walter Lee from his father when they were both alive. Walter Lee also has a nickname, and he is called Prometheus by George Murchison. And Walter is confused. He's not even sure Prometheus exists. Prometheus does exist from Greek mythology. And basically, Prometheus stole fire from the gods, gave it to humankind as a gift. And basically, Prometheus was punished for stealing from the gods. And if you can think about parallels with Walter, Walter basically steals the insurance money from his sister, and he will be punished for his deeds. Also, this idea of being superior to the gods, Walter thinks he's superior to all of the family members and that his way is the right way. Obviously, he has a good amount of learning to do over the course of the play. Walter wants more. He wants a liquor store, and that's part of the idea of the American dream. And this play is both about dreams in general, which we saw played out with the Langston Hughes poem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred, but also we see played out with the American dream. Part of the American dream is home ownership, and that definitely is an impetus in this play. But it also is owning one's own business, not having to work for someone else, being respected, getting a college education, and something that Walter wants for Travis, as well as something that Beneatha is trying to aspire for herself. And we see how Walter is punished for his hubris, a word we've used before in Oedipus the King, in the way that Prometheus was also punished for his hubris as well. And of course, Mama objects to the idea of a liquor store because it tends to be predatory on a community that already is disenfranchised. And that said, Walter is convinced that this is the quick and easy way to earn money. We see them come to heads over this, and ultimately Mama makes perhaps a poor decision by giving Walter the rest of the money that is part of the insurance policy. So basically, the numbers we're talking about can be multiplied by approximately 10 to give us a sense of how inflation has played a role. So $10,000 would be slightly over $100,000 in today's money. When Mama gives Walter $6,500, basically she's giving him the equivalent of about $65,000 in our money today, with instructions to put half away for Beneatha's schooling and to use half in the way that he deems best. And of course, the question is, should she have given him the money? We can't know definitively, but we do know this, that she does allow him the opportunity to fail and fail spectacularly. And because he fails, he comes into his own by the ending of the play, realizing that dignity is worth so much more than money. I don't know if Walter would have made that transition if he hadn't have failed as spectacularly as he did. When we have a Walter at the beginning of the play who tells the sister, "Oh, why can't you be a nurse like other women, or just get married and shut up?" To the very ending of the play when Walter tells Lidler, "My sister, she's going to be a doctor." Obviously, sexism is a major element of this play, but so is racism and classism and generational conflict. This play is very rich with lots of elements that you could examine. And I don't know if Walter would have necessarily have come to that conclusion about the importance of dignity and the importance of family if he hadn't have lost the money. We could never know for certain. But I do liken it to parents knowing that their children likely will make mistakes and yet trusting them because of the importance of showing trust within their child, even if the parent is certain that the child will ultimately misuse that trust. No easy answers here. But in terms of Ruth Younger, Walter's wife, think about how often the Bible plays a role in literature. And there is a biblical Ruth. And Ruth is a long-suffering daughter-in-law in the Bible who's quite loyal. And we can see that within her character as well. We see how she's torn between supporting her husband and supporting her mother-in-law. Her personality is closer to that of her mother-in-law's, but of course, she has a bond with her husband. And while we see her not necessarily lose hope in the way that Mama does at one point, thinking that they can't move, we see Ruth's quiet desperation when she's contemplating an abortion in a time in which abortion is illegal. And that means that she's grappling with more than just the religious consequences of the decision she's making. And there are religious consequences to the decision she's making because she comes from a religious background. And at one point, when Mama's ready to give up, Ruth says that she will strap that baby on her back if necessary so they can earn the money for maintaining the mortgage. In some ways, Ruth is ruthless in terms of the pursuit of her dream, the American dream, which is home ownership, having a place that's safe for her son and her yet unborn baby. Of course, Benita, or I should say, yes, Benita, I'm sorry. Benita asks, where's that baby going to sleep? On the roof. And of course, Benita tries to backtrack, but it's the truth that they really don't have much in the way of space or opportunities. So there is a real reality that has to be addressed about the economic impact of this child. It's more than just the emotional impact of this child. And I think that when we see Travis younger, we'll see that he's not named Walter the way his father and his grandfather were, because he's supposed to choose his own way. Notice how at the beginning of the play, he wants to carry his own groceries, which shows a certain level of independence and autonomy. Though we could see that as a negative as well, that he's so concerned with money and he's so young, much like his father. He buys Mama his own gift. He doesn't go in with everybody else. So again, think about the idea that Travis is going to be different. And the version of the play that we saw deletes scenes, mostly because of length, sometimes because of cost, because an additional actor would have to be hired, such as with Mrs. Johnson, who is a neighbor that I will be talking about soon. But the idea behind Travis not necessarily wanting to be like his family is something that I think we can grasp regardless of the film version that we saw or the text version that we saw. But one of the elements that's left out of the film, which gives Walter a certain level of complexity, is when Walter is talking with Travis and he's sort of fantasizing about what their futures will be like after Walter makes a business deal. And Walter talks about the importance of allowing Travis to have educational opportunity to choose any college he wants when he's 17. So this is perhaps a softer, gentler side to Walter that we don't necessarily see in that particular film version that we saw. Though I had talked about the Danny Glover version that's on YouTube, and that is close to an hour longer, and you can see all those deleted scenes. But of course, as I've mentioned many times, watching a performance is in no way a substitute for reading. So at this point, you should be either done with reading A Raisin in the Sun or close to it. Beneath the Younger, and she has a very unusual name, Beneath, in that she's seen as beneath others because of her youth. We see that generational conflict there. Because of her gender, because she's a woman. Because of her ethnicity, because she's black. Because of her class, because she's poor. Or we could also flip this and say that Benita sees others as beneath her because she's educating herself, and she also is trying to incorporate her cultural identity in a way that other characters aren't. And her nickname is Alayo, and she's given this nickname by one of her boyfriends. This happens to be Joseph Asagai. And Alayo means one for whom bread or food is not enough. So we see her ambition. And this can be both positive and negative. You know, the idea that she wants to be a doctor, a very esteemed profession that oftentimes is associated with males, particularly during this time period. Her hobbies are quite interesting. She wants to do things and has done things like horseback riding and photography. These are expensive hobbies. And again, notice she doesn't have a job. So in other words, the family's supporting her. Or as Walter says, Travis has gone 2 semesters without new shoes. So in some ways, we could see a certain level of selfishness to Benita in the same way we see a certain level of selfishness to Walter. She flits from hobby to hobby, and one might say she also flits from boyfriend to boyfriend, and that she's balancing two at the same time. George Murchison, who she admits that she doesn't have any kind of personal connection with, it's more social. And then Joseph Asagai. And her nickname is Benny, and that's a very male nickname because she oftentimes appears very male for the time period, thinking about a male profession or even contemplating not even getting married. Going back to her hobbies, think about how absurd it is that someone in Chicago was taking horseback riding lessons. If this were, let's say, in Western Massachusetts, it would make a lot more sense, but not in the city. So again, we can see a certain level of frivolity to her, which perhaps is illustrated with one of her boyfriends, George Murchison, and that she freely admits she's enjoying the social activities with him, but she doesn't really feel any kind of close connection with him. George Murchison, the last name, he's the son of a merchant, and this is how they've acquired their money. George. If you think about famous Georges in our history, you could think about George Washington, the first president of the United States. And of course, if this play is about the American dream, that would seem to fit nicely. George is also very much a Western name, an American name. And George is very much assimilated into society in a way that Joseph Asagai has not. Joseph Asagai has found a way to balance both his cultural identity and also his American connection. Just think of his last name, Asagai, which is, of course, very African, and his first name, Joseph, which not only has biblical significance, and religion is important in this text, but also is a very American name and a very Western name. He encourages Benita's cultural identity, and he believes that education, in part, is for helping Africa. There's a scene that's cut out of the Sidney Poitier version that we saw that gives us a clearer sense of this when Joseph Asagai talks about some of his goals for his countrymen. We also see a softer side to Benita as well in her responses about talking about wanting to become a doctor, which at the time would have been seen as perhaps the pinnacle of esteemed professions. But she talks about wanting to help and cure people. So there are some nuances in the play that we don't necessarily get in the film version. Talking about Mr. Lidner, notice he's given the title of Mr., the title of respect, in a way that the other characters aren't. Of course, he represents Racist America and the Welcoming Committee. And if you were to watch any of the Danny Glover version on YouTube of A Raisin in the Sun, I recommend you might want to watch the last scene when Walter comes into his own. The same actor who played Lidner in the Sidney Poitier version also played Lidner 20 years later in the Danny Glover version. The only character that is not age specific is Lidner. Mrs. Wilhelmina Othello Johnson. This is a neighbor, and this scene is cut from the film version that we saw. It is included again in the Sidney Poitier, or I'm sorry, in the Danny Glover, in the newer version. And her name is quite a mouthful. I'll be talking a little bit about her scenes later, but basically, she's a neighbor who comes, in theory, to support the family, but the reality is that she's taking great delight over the possibility that the family is going to be experiencing backlash, being the first Black family moving into a Caucasian neighborhood. Which, by the way, is loosely autobiographical for Lorraine Hansberry's own life. When she was a child, her parents moved into a Caucasian neighborhood, and there was lots of backlash about it. It was a case that ended up going to the Supreme Court, actually. But of course, Lorraine Hansberry would have made some changes for dramatic purposes. But this neighbor goes to show the kinds of obstacles that this family has to overcome. That not only do they have to overcome the Lidners of the world, the people who are different from them, but they also have to overcome their own neighbors and their own friends because of their jealousy and their envy. And if you look at the name Johnson, which is the last name of the neighbor, that's a very common name. So we might say that this is a very common situation. Also, Wilhelmina Othello, if you know the play Othello by William Shakespeare, then you know that Othello happens to be about a Black man who marries a white woman and the jealousy and envy and backlash that results. In other words, it's very similar to the play A Raisin in the Sun. And what we've got, or at least in terms of racism, and what we've got is not Othello, but Othella, and that Lorraine Hansberry has given the female twist on Othello. And Wilhelmina is the female of William. And of course, Shakespeare's first name is William. So that's a little wink and a nod to William Shakespeare's Othello when we learn about our neighbor, Wilhelmina Othello Johnson. And quite telling when, after she leaves, the comment is that if there are two things that we've got to fear, one is the Ku Klux Klan, the other is Mrs. Johnson. that both could be equal threats. Perhaps Mrs. Johnson even more so because of the guise that she takes about being a friend and a supporter. Even minor characters, Bobo, for instance, where Walter makes a business deal with Bobo. Bobo means idiot. And might I suggest that Walter's an idiot and so is Bobo, for entrusting their money to Willie. Willie runs off with the money, and Willie is a slang term for penis, which is how he acts, basically. A real, well, for lack of a better word, dick. So, again, these names are very deliberate. And even the plant, I would suggest that the plant is as much a character as any of the other characters in this play. And this plant represents this family, and it's barely hanging on, much like the family. It's surviving against the odds, like the family, because of Mama's love, like the family. The plant is basically in need of a new home, like the family. It needs a place to spread out its roots. And roots could be the literal roots of the plant or the roots of the family as well. So, and it's very important that in the last scene, Mom almost forgets the plant, but then she comes back to the apartment to take the plant, because the plant, as she says at one point, it represents me, and it represents the caretaking of the family. That plant needs more sunlight, much like the family does as well. And even think about the title, A Raisin in the Sun, which comes from the poem about dreams deferred. And again, it talks about what happens to a dream. Can it dry out like a raisin in the sun? A raisin is a fruit. It's basically a grape that has dried out, but it still has nutrition. It still has flavor. But if you were to take a raisin and put it in the sun, it would lose all of its water. It would lose all of its life force, and it would basically become inedible. It would turn to dust. And that's what's happening to this family, is that they're slowly dying inside and they're turning to dust. That said, think about color imagery. Raisins are dark, suns are light. And of course, the issue of racism is about dark skin versus white skin. Or also think about the slang term for raising. If you drop your G, you would say raisin. I'm raising a family, and this is all about raising, well, sons, not S-U-N, but S-O-N. Mama's raising Walter, and Walter is raising Travis. Or maybe Mama's raising Travis as well. So, and this entire family is trying to raise itself up or to improve its situation. So you can get the sense of how deliberate Lorraine Hansberry is with just something as simple as the use of names. And I think about, some of the quotes from the play. And this is what I wanted to talk about next class, would be some of the quotes, as well as the Langston Hughes poem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred. Does it fester like a sore as part of the poem? Think about that idea of disease and contagion, and the idea that Walter's being eaten up alive by disease or contagion. Or does it stink like rotten meat? And this idea of decay, that Walter's decaying, this family's decaying. Or is it syrupy sweet? This unpleasant or fake sweetness. It reminds me of Mrs. Othello Johnson, Mrs. Wilhelmina Othello Johnson, who's pretending to be supportive when she's really not. Does it sag like a heavy load? And I can't help but think of Ruth. In fact, the actor who plays Ruth in the Sidney Poitier version, she does such a good job of having her shoulders always be hunched over to illustrate how burdened she is, literally and also symbolically. I love the fact that Ruth makes scrambled eggs for Walter at the beginning of the play when she asks him what kind of eggs he wants, and he says anything but scrambled, and she does it. One could say that Walter himself is all scrambled up in terms of his dreams. And also we see a little bit of Ruth's exertion of power. She may not have power over her life, but she can decide what to make for breakfast by scrambling those eggs. And also we see a little bit of passive-aggressive behavior. This gives us a sense of their relationship as well. And in that Langston Hughes poem, we're told, or does a dream deferred explode in anger and violence. And we see how Walter's always on the cusp of anger and violence. In fact, he even talks about himself as being a kind of volcano, that he's ready to erupt, that he's a giant, everyone around him are ants. We know that Mama's dream ultimately is to have a home for the family, sunlight and garden, but her dream also is for her son to live up to the image of his father and to turn into a man, which he does by the ending of the play, where he realizes that dignity is more important than money. That said, we can think about the idea of perhaps Walter accepting the money, and yes, that would mean he would sacrifice his dignity, unless he accepted the money and bought, because it would be at a profit to the family, another house in Clybourne Park, and continued to do so by selling and buying houses in Clybourne Park, by being bought out by the neighbors, until basically he owns Clybourne Park. That might be the most clever thing to do from a capitalistic perspective, but it may not necessarily be the most moral thing to do, or perhaps the best thing to do in terms of his character. And again, the question of the play is, how do you put a price tag on character? And of course, at one point, Mama is ready to give up all of her dreams for a home and sunlight and family. A lot of this play is about hope and the loss of hope, more so than the loss of money, because the reality is Mama's already paid for the home as a down payment. The reality is that she gave the rest of the money to Walter, half for Beneatha's schooling. True, Beneatha won't have money for her schooling, but one suspects that she's bright enough and clever enough that she would figure out how to do that on her own. And half for Walter. So let's say he did open that liquor store, and let's say he failed. No loss, no gain, at least in terms of the family. So they had enough to move into the house. And as Ruth says, I'll strap that baby to my back if I have to, and we can all work. So they were planning on basically moving to that house without that $6,500. It was more the devastation of what that $6,500 represented that led to the sense of hopelessness and helplessness with the family. And one of the reasons why Mama is so against liquor, because liquor oftentimes appeals to the hopeless and to those feeling helpless. So Walter, of course, he wants wealth, he wants to be a business owner, and he wants to be the family caretaker. Ruth wants a growing family, or a home for her growing family, and also privacy. Think about those awkward moments where basically they have to share space with their mother-in-law. Beneatha wants an education and a career and identity. She also wants respect as a woman. Travis, I talked about that again. He doesn't necessarily have as much screen time or stage time as some of the other characters, but even he's quite telling in his desire to carry groceries, which can be seen both as a positive and negative. And the dates might be a little bit off, but not much, because if we think about what Travis's age would be at the time in which this play was written, if we fast forward to our time period, he'd be around the age of Barack Obama. And I don't think that Lorraine Hansberry could have ever envisioned a world where a black man would be a president. And I'm not talking about politics. I'm basically talking about the historical significance. Please ignore my phone. That's the problem with basically recording live. So since I'm near the ending, I'm just going to finish this off. One of the things I wanted to point to, and this will be in our next class, is talking about how literary Lorraine Hansberry is in her writing, even her stage directions. There are elements of or dialogue that shows things like sexism or the dire situation the family is in. One piece that is omitted from the Sidney Poitier version that we do see in the in the actual text itself is when it's a small episode but an important one, when Ruth and Mama and Beneatha are talking about the new baby or the possibility of a new baby, and outside the window there's a commotion because Travis is playing out in the street with rats. And I wanted to read that to you next class. And it goes to show how dire things are. The American dream, you would have a home with a white picket fence where there would be a backyard where the children would play with puppies or cats or kittens. And instead we have Travis playing in the street with rats, which goes to show how dire, again, things are. Even something as simple as George Murchison and his white shoes, which is criticized by Walter. Think about the color symbolism of white, dark and light. And Walter is very mean-spirited when he points out those white shoes. This idea that Mrs. Johnson is just as bad as the Ku Klux Klan. Walter talking about his dreams for Travis going to college. When Beneatha says, when Mr. Lindner is with them, first from the welcoming committee, saying that ultimately he's willing to buy them out, Beneatha makes an offhand statement saying 30 pieces and not a coin left. That's a biblical reference to the idea of Judas, who betrayed Christ, being given 30 pieces of gold. Perhaps one of the most important quotes in the text that I'll talk about next class. You can see the notes below. That's on page 121, at least in my version. That the question is, well, what is Clybourne Park so afraid of? The family is asking. That we're going to eat them? And the response is, no, we're going to marry them. About the dilution of bloodlines. Mama talking about how the plant expresses her, which it does, and as I suggested, the family as a whole. Some of Asaga's dreams to go back to Africa and to help his fellow countrymen. One of my favorite quotes on page 145 when Mama talks about when is the time to love somebody. Not when they've done well, but when they've done poorly and they need your support. Walter's incredible transformation at the ending of the play when he tells Lindner that they have pride and they won't accept Lindner's offer. And again, talk about a 180-degree turn when Walter says, my sister, she's going to be a doctor. This from the Walter at the beginning of the play where it says, why can't you be a nurse like other women or just get married and shut up? And again, could Walter have ever achieved that place if he hadn't failed and failed so badly? And then finally, Mama walking out with the plant. But I thought what I could do next class is talk a little bit about those quotes, and then we could move forward into talking about our poetry section. So that will be the last section that we're doing over the course of the semester. And again, you can see that we have, we've got a journal due that will be due soon. And we also have a paper that will be done soon, or due soon. So for today's question for the attendance is about asking you about your paper. And certainly you don't need to commit to this, but asking them at this point, do you have an idea of which play you would be writing your paper about and why? And of course, you can always change your mind, but I wanted you to begin thinking about paper number 2. So you're thinking about devoting your paper to Oedipus? Are you thinking about Midsummer Night's Dream? Or are you thinking about Raisin? And the reason why. Again, no right or wrong answer. And as always, you don't necessarily have to respond to your classmates, but do read their responses because they're quite enlightening. And you can get a sense as to the kind of conversations we would have had in class. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will finish up with some quotation from A Raisin in the Sun and begin our our poetry section. Take care. Bye-bye.